did you become aware and involved with sort of problems with the Hudson River? What made you notice that it was having problems and that it's getting dirtier and dirtier and in trouble?
My thinking got switched around when I read the book Silent Spring in 1963 by the biologist Rachel Carson. A very quiet little book, simply pointing out that the poisons we used, like DDT, were killing off the birds. And I suddenly realized, in the space of a few months, that if the world were going to be saved, it wasn't just poor people organizing against the rich, but scientists working with wide range of people to alert them to the fact that the world is in real danger, and there may not be any human race here in 100 years unless we change our way of thinking. Up till now, the main thing has been money and power and sex, I suppose. Well, about that same time, I had gotten interested in sailing. I'd started earning a little money, and I bought a little plastic bathtub of a boat and took my family out in it. And you'd be sailing along and suddenly look down and you see lumps of this and that floating by with the toilet paper. And I thought of the phrase, private affluence, public squalor, thought of by the economist Galbraith. I didn't know quite what to do about it. Just about that time, a friend of mine, an artist in Cold Spring, Vic Schwartz by name, says, "Pete, they used to have big sailboats on the river. Ones with a boom 70 feet long." I said, "Oh, don't give me that. Only America's Cup Racer was a sloop that big." He says, "No, I got a book about it." And he loaned me a fat little book written in the year 1907 by two middle-aged men right here in this part of the world. It was called Sloops of the Hudson, by William Verplanck and Moses Collier. Well, I read it fascinated. These two men were not great writers, but it was a book full of love. They said, "These were the most beautiful boats we ever knew, and they will never be seen again." Steam had taken over the river. Well, I read it and reread it, wrote a little poem, put it on my wall, couldn't get it out of my head. And finally, about a year or two later, I write a letter to my friend. I said, "Vic, nobody but a millionaire could afford to build one of these boats, but if we got 1,000 people together and we all chipped in, we could share the expense of building it and share the fun of sailing it. We'd probably have to hire a very professional captain to make sure we didn't make any mistakes, but the rest of us could be volunteers." It was an idea for a little middle-class cooperative of sort. Then I forgot about my letter. It was one more pipe dream. But about 4 months later, Vic Schwartz meets me on the railroad station platform. He said, "Pete, when are we going to get started with that boat?" I said, "What boat?" He said, "You wrote me a letter." Oh, I said, "That's as foolish as to say, let's build a canoe and paddle to Tahiti." He said, "Well, I've been passing your letter up and down the commuter train, and we got a couple dozen people who want to get started." I said, "Well, if there's enough nuts, we might do it." Just about that time, Alexander Saunders ran a small business in Cold Spring, and he asked Vic, do you know this guy Seeger? Maybe he'd give a fundraising concert for the Scenic Hudson organization. That organization had just started. It was trying to stop a power plant on the mountain just a few miles south of here. Then Mr. Saunders went to the board of directors meeting, and was told, oh, don't have anything to do with Seeger. A few years ago, he was sentenced to a year in jail for not cooperating with the House Un-American Activities Committee. If we have anything to do with him, we will be tarred with the same brush. So Saunders came back and said, well, Vic, they turned me down, but I'd like to hear some music. Maybe we can raise money for something else. And Vic said, well, Pete and I have been talking about raising money to build a replica of a Hudson River sloop. Oh, that's interesting. And about a month or two later, on the lawn of the Saunders home, I sang for about 150 people, a collection of Hudson River songs and songs they could sing along with me, like This Land Is Your Land. And in the Saunders living room, some 15 or more people sat around, and we set up an ad hoc committee to look into the idea. One subcommittee was supposed to look to see if there are any Hudson River sloops still in existence. There weren't. And a lawyer said he would get us set up as a nonprofit corporation. We called ourselves the Hudson River Sloop Restoration, Inc. Nonprofit. And we met once a month. Well, I think when we passed the hat during the intermission and got about $150 to start us off. But I gave some outdoor concerts here and there around, and I think the first year we raised about $5,000. We also found it would cost a lot more than that. Down in New York, they wanted $300,000 to build it. But up in Maine, we found a man willing to build it for $120,000. Old Harvey Gamage, crusty old Maine fellow. He'd been used to slapping out boats for fishermen, shrimp trawlers, and so on. Saunders was the de facto head of the organization. I was chairman, but it was just a figurehead job. I attended the meetings, but Saunders really was a very strong leader. He was the president, and he'd look at his watch, says, I have a meeting in an hour and a quarter, let's get cracking. And if he'd stop somebody, he said, Joe, you made your point. Anybody else want to comment on it? He ran very good meetings, not too long, and we met every month. And we had an outdoor festival in Garrison under that beautiful castle. It looks like Camelot on the hill. And I think we raised about $1,500. And we had another festival the next year for more like twice as many people and raise more money. The third year, 1968, Arlo Guthrie was our guest star, and 6,000 people came. I remember in the morning somebody said, Pete, when is this boat ever going to be built? And I said, oh, at the rate we're going, it'll be a number of years. We raised 5,000 the first year, 10,000 the second year, and now in the third year, I don't know. My friend said, well, won't people give up? Won't they lose interest if it takes so long? I said, all we can do is try. But that year, with 6,000 people coming, we raised about $10,000, and a local disc jockey got on the microphone, and in half an hour got about $10,000 worth of pledges. And to my great surprise, Mrs. Lila Atchison Wallace, the co-editor of the Reader's Digest, pledged $10,000. If anybody had ever told me she would contribute to something I was connected with, I'd said, you're out of your mind. I mean, they were conservative Republicans. had articles like, "We are winning in Vietnam." Well, I was singing songs against the Vietnam War. Actually, some of the members of the committee resigned. The vice president said, "As long as Seeger's connected with this project, it'll never get anywhere. He doesn't know how to work with the establishment." And to a certain extent, he was right. On the other hand, he later on became mayor of Newburgh across the river, and he learned that the establishment never can move unless the people push them from one direction or another. He's a good friend now. We've made up. Anyway, up in Maine, Harvey Gamage says, "Let's get started building." I said, "Wait a minute, we only have $30,000, and we don't know how we're going to get the rest." He says, "Well, you'll find when the keel is laid, the money comes in quicker." And he was right. Once you've actually got started, then you have to go into high gear. So in the month of October '68, the keel was laid up there in Maine. I hope you'll show some of the movies we took of it. All I know is that it was a good experience for me. We're working with a wide range of people, young and old, different kinds of politics, different kinds of music. Some were artists, some were, one was a minor echelon executive at IBM. And a year later, in June 1969, the Clearwater was launched. Since then,
wait, tell me more about that day when it was launched and people there, and did you sing?
Well, Toshi got some women here in Beacon to cook food, and they drove all the way up there in like a 6-hour trip or more. And we had a fine potluck lunch at very low cost.
Now tell me about Toshi and the food, how people won't come if there's no food.
Well, we had a song fest. While people were arriving, they drove in from different parts of Maine and New England and up and down the river. A whole busload of young black people came from Newburgh. I remember when we were singing "This Land Is Your Land," they were on next, and they say, "You can talk about your Constitution, but we're here to talk about revolution." Some people say, "What's going on here?" And finally, when about 2,000 people were there, they had a bottle of Hudson River champagne whacked against the hull, and it finally broke, and it slid in the water. The captain of the Clearwater was on the stern as it slid in, and with his head down, watching it splash into the water. Oh, the captain, I might say, had golden curls to his shoulder, and when he first came up to Maine and was helping get the boat rigged, they said, "This is a captain?" They couldn't believe it. Up in Maine, they thought, "Oh, this boat is going to be sunk or sold within a year. What do these hippies know about sailing?" But Captain Alan Onapu was a very good captain, really very good. And we put together a crew of musicians. At least 2 or 3 knew how to sail. Some of the others, Don McLean slapped the bowsprit, says, "What is this, a boom?" And I remember Brother Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick. He and Jimmy Collier were both singers in the civil rights movement, and they came up to be on the crew. They were wonderful singers, but they'd never been on boats before. I remember as we were sailing, going up and down, Kirk was looking very serious, and I knew he was thinking, "How did I ever get Seeger, get me out here where am I? Out of sight of land. But it was a great singing crew, and we would sail for 25 miles, and then we'd put on a fundraising concert. First in one little town, and then next day 25 miles down the coast in another little town. We hired a young woman to go from town to town to town, finding a location that we could sing outdoors usually. And when we got to New York, 35 days later, we'd raised about $30,000, which had to be used to pay off loans that we got. My wife got on the phone to all the musicians we knew, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and others, said, will you loan us some money to get this boat sailing? Mary Travers of Peter, Paul, and Mary says, Pete, there's a war on. What are you raising money for a sailboat for? And all I could say, well, it's a beautiful river, and we're not aiming just to sail it. We want to clean up the river. At the annual membership meeting in October, was it in October? No, the annual membership meeting, that's right, in December. At the annual membership meeting in December, it was a close vote. Almost half the people wanted to call the boat Heritage and make it a historical project like the Mayflower, dress the sailors in costume. But by a narrow vote, Clearwater won the vote, and the younger members of the organization, anybody could become a member by paying $10. Oh my gosh, now it costs $30 or more dollars, $35 to be a member. And they, a year later, voted to change the constitution of the organization, the charter, saying the purpose of the Clearwater is to clean up the river and make the shores accessible to everybody. And step by step, we found ways to do this. One of the first big discoveries we made was learning how to take school children out. The first time we took a group of kids out, a biologist stood up on the cabin roof and shouted, "Kids, now I'll tell you something about the river." But 15 minutes later, he was hoarse, and the kids weren't listening anyway. They were looking at this 100-foot mast and looking at the view. They'd never been on a sailboat before. And about a year or two later, a young man named Steve Stan joined the organization. I trust you're interviewing him. A remarkable man. And he invented a way to teach on the boat. When a bus pulls up with 50 kids, they're immediately split up into 5 groups. One group goes to the starboard side, and the crew, the teachers, could be a volunteer, holds up a net. Kids, we're going to put this net in the water and catch some fish. Sometimes they make a joke out of it. One of the other volunteers pretends to be a nudnik and says, "What do you mean? There's no fish in the river. It's too dirty. Will you please help me here? I'm trying to teach the kids something. Hold this net. I got to see if there's any holes in it." "A net's nothing but holes." It's a little comic dialogue that they'll carry on. Kids are all laughing. Well, another group of 10 children go to the port side, and a net is put in as fine as a lady's stocking and comes up with some green slime on it. And it's put on under a microscope. "Hey, what's those wiggly things?" And the volunteer crew, who a few years ago was my 12-year-old granddaughter, says, "That's called plankton. Plankton is for fish what grass is for cows." Another group of 10 goes to the tiller, a big 12-foot stick with a fist at the end. And the captain says, "Push that stick to starboard." That means over there. "Now push it to port." That means over here. Now hold it amidships. The kid said, we're steering the boat. And they are. Another 10 go below deck and learn how the captain uses charts and other modern tools to know the depth of the water, and he can communicate, get on the earphones with another ship. So for safety, it's a lot safer than it was 150 years ago. Oh, I should tell you, that little book is now reprinted, and I hope you give a plug for it because it's a wonderful little book. There were 400 boats like the Clearwater in the middle of the 19th century. This river would have been full of sails. Some sloops were as big as 95 feet long, some as small as 50 or 60 feet. But the average is what the Clearwater was. Clearwater is 76 feet on deck, 105 feet from the tip of the bowsprit to the tip of the boom. Well, anyway, the Clearwater system of teaching on deck is now used by schooners mostly all over the country because people in other parts of America said, hey, look what they're doing on the Hudson. Why don't we do something like it? A woman down on Delaware Bay read about the Clearwater. She brought some friends up. They sailed on the Clearwater as volunteers. And they went back and found an old schooner rotting away in a mud bank, and they hauled it out of the water. And it took 10 years, but sooner or later they had a boat sailing just like Clearwater on Delaware Bay. They have 2 schooners in Chesapeake Bay, and I think soon we'll have 3. They have a schooner off Sarasota, Florida, 2 schooners in Lake Michigan, a big schooner in Puget Sound, the Adventurous, and actually one of the Clearwater volunteer crew got trained and was captain of the Adventurous. 3 or maybe 4 schooners going up the New England coast. And they all use the Clearwater system of teaching. It's found that the whole idea of sailing, there's something spiritual in it, I think. Water, wind, wave action, it's hard to put in words. The nearest thing I can think of the appeal is, think the wind may be coming from the north, but if you slant your sails right, you can sail northwest, and then you can sail northeast, and then you can sail northwest. You can use the very power of the wind against you to work your way forward, and that's good politics. Martin Luther King would zig and zag, and he'd get thrown in jail and get more contributions, and zag over there and get more contributions. Yes, life is a zigzag.